All right, we are recording and we're going to get into it. So on this video, I'm actually going to be sitting down and sharing with you my personal story of my experience with spiritual abuse. I just dropped a video and I'm going to link it down in the description where I was talking about the power of sharing your story and how sharing your story can actually help you in your healing process, help you in your healing journey. And so definitely check that out after you check this video out on my story. So as we jump into this, first off, I want to say there's two reasons that I want to share my personal story of spiritual abuse and why I feel like it needs to be shared. Number one being to expose what can be happening in these types of organizations, what can be happening in these types of churches. And it's not an exposure to say we're pointing a finger at somebody or we're trying to call out a leader or trying to embarrass a leader or something like that. I think the more important thing is the exposure that it can help in that leadership position, or men and women that find themselves in that organization, they can get some clarity, get some understanding through that exposure so that as they begin to be aware and begin to understand what the behavior is doing to them or what that behavior may be doing to others, they can have a chance and an opportunity to repent from that and go on to building God's church. That's the first main reason, is to exposing this. Exposing this is an issue. We know it's happening, but just being able to talk about it. And then the second reason that I want to share my story is encouragement. One of the things that I realized and I went through even on my own journey was, as you come out of a spiritually abusive church and organization, one of the difficult things is being in a place where you feel like nobody understands or nobody can empathize with what I've gone through and what I'm experiencing inside. And so you get to this point where you feel like nobody can really understand what you're going through. And I know what helped me out was, as I began to start researching, as I began to start learning, as I began to start allowing God to really show me what happened, God allowed me to see that there were other people that have gone through the similar situation. They've experienced these difficult situations and these difficult emotions and these difficult feelings. And I began to start realizing that these people were able to make it on the other side of it. They were able to find healing. They were able to find some understanding through their situation and what they had gone through. And so that to me was so key. And so part of my sharing my story is really to try and help bring encouragement to somebody that may be going through that right now, or maybe you're in a season where you've just come out of that and you're trying to figure out and find your way. My encouragement to you here is, look, there are other people that have gone through and are feeling what you've felt and are dealing with what you have, dealt with. And the encouragement there that is, as you look and you see my story, other stories, you can recognize that there is a hope that on the other side of this, God can bring us healing and God can bring us back to wholeness. And then the third reason that I want to share my story with you on this is the fact that we really need to point back to Christ. When I experience everything and when I think back, I realize that a lot of what we're dealing with and a lot of what we see happen in these cases of spiritual abuse revolves around the fact that we really need to point back to Christ. It's because of Christ that we even have the opportunity to be in a church. It's because of Christ that we have this opportunity to experience God's love and to experience God's grace. And so it's so important for us to be able to point what has happened. It's so important for us to point our lives and our hearts really back to Christ, because that's where at the end of the day we're really going to be able to find a lot of healing from it. So let's jump into my personal story with spiritual abuse. So backtracking, my whole journey, even in the church and even in my Christianity and in my faith, started back in 2008. During that time, I was in the military. I was currently on deployment, and quite honestly, it was a difficult point in my life. It was a very dark moment in my life. I know during that time, I was drinking a lot. I was partying a lot. I was trying to find all these different things outside of myself to try and help find and bring some kind of peace internally. And that's really what I was looking for. And so I was turning to all these different vices, turning to all these different behaviors. And I recognized that the more that I indulged in a lot of these behaviors, the more that I tried to look outside of myself and tried to find the answer to all these different things, the more I felt like I was falling deeper and deeper into this pit, if you will. And I remember as I was going on that deployment and getting ready to head out, I remember finding a Bible within my room and saying, you know what, I'm just going to bring this. Maybe as I'm out there on deployment, we're going to have so much extra time on our hands. Maybe this might be an opportunity for me to just start looking at the Bible, start reading the Bible, trying to find hope somewhere. What was interesting for me is that I grew up in church. I grew up in a very Christian home, I guess you could say. My parents, they didn't drink, they didn't smoke, they didn't party, they didn't do any of those different things. And so I never grown up seeing all those different things, but I did grow up going to church on Sundays, praying, reading the Word of God in the home. And so as I began to start reading this Bible as at that time, God began to start reminding me of a lot of lessons, reminding me of a lot of things that I did learn as I was growing up as a kid. And those things begin to start really resonating within my own spirit. Something happened on that deployment where I recognized all the different things that I'm trying to do and everything that I'm trying to accomplish or the void that I'm trying to fill. I began to start realizing and recognizing that it was through God, it was through Christ that I was really going to be able to find and fill that void. And I remember being in a space on this ship, I'm by myself reading this Bible, and I remember praying and asking God, you know what, God, help me. You got to show me what I need to do to really just begin to turn my life around. And so in that moment, I decided to give my life to Christ, give my life to God. It wasn't a sinner's prayer where I was saying there, going through my sinner ABCs. I didn't do any of that. I just asked God, look, God, I need your help. And if you're willing to help me and if you're willing to work with me, I'll do whatever you need me to do in order to, fulfill whatever purpose that you might have for my life. Immediately after making that decision, I ran into someone that was on the ship with me. We had known each other from before. We had seen each other kind of like in passing. We weren't, really close friends or anything like that, but we were on watch one night, really late at night, about 2-3 o'clock in the morning. I began to start sharing with him what I was experiencing and what I had happened to me while I was out here on this deployment. And he turned out to be a Christian. He started working with me, started helping me out. Really good, dear friend of mine. And throughout that deployment, he was really there to help me to stay on course, to stay on track. We began doing Bible studies together. We began to start this really great friendship and really great relationship. And it just felt encouraging to know that here I am. I make this decision to say, you know what, I'm going to give my life to God. I'm going to give my life to Christ. And he comes along and he's there to help guide me through what that process looks like and what that situation could look like for me. And that helped me out so much, so tremendously. And we went through that whole deployment. We were Liberty buddies. He helped me out just to keep me on track, not to do stupid stuff while I was out in port and over on these different countries and stuff like that. But long story short, we ended up getting back in to our home port. And I remember pulling back in the same week of us coming off a deployment. And I remember saying to my friend, hey, look, once I get back, I know myself. I know the people that I hang out with. I know the things that I like to get involved with. I said, man, if I don't figure out how to get involved in a church, I'm going to probably slip back into the same things that I was doing before I left from deployment. And he agreed with me. He said, you know what, you're making a really good point. And so I began to start going to Bible studies with him. I remember going to the first Bible study with him. We're there, walking to this house. There's probably about 20, 30 people there. They're all young. They're all like my age. They're talking about all the things that God is doing for them. They're talking about all the ways God is helping their marriage and helping them through all these difficult things and helping them through all these difficult circumstances. And I remember just sitting there and thinking to myself, wow, this is amazing. Because when you grow up in, the church that we grew up in, it's all like, for the most part, older folks, and it's hard to really connect. It's hard to really understand what they're talking about when it comes to Christianity and their own faith journey. But here's this group of individuals. They're all the same age as me. God is doing these amazing things in their life. And I was so excited, man. And immediately, as soon as I got there, I said, hey, man, I think this is a place where I feel like I can really grow. I really feel like I can connect with the people that are there. I really feel like that it would make a lot of sense for me to be here. And so that's what I decided to do. That week that we pulled in the port Friday, I was at a Bible study Friday night. Sunday morning, I was at the church that my friend that was on the ship went to. And so I got to the church. To be honest with you, in the beginning, it was a little bit off. It was a little bit different from what I remember experiencing growing up in church. They did things a little bit differently. They did things that were not what I was really used to. But I just remember in the back of my mind thinking, you know what, I've got to be in a place that's going to help me to make these changes in my life. So in the beginning of my experience there in the church, everything was so new. As a new person being there in the church, it was several hundred people there. People were younger. People were just fired up. They were excited about doing something for God. A lot of the people in there were military, so there was a lot of structure. And for me, that's what I needed. I needed a place to where I can get in there. I'm an action person. I'm a results type of person. Just let me know what I need to do to be close to God. Let me know what I need to do to fill this void, to kind of find some hope. And if you give me the blueprint and you tell me what I need to do, I will follow that exactly. If on the other end of that, you promise that, hey, this is going to get you, this is going to be something that is going to help you to draw closer to God. And that's what they did. They gave me the blueprint. They gave me the pattern, is what they called it, of learning how to love God and learning how to trust God and learning how to trust Christ. And so in the beginning, everything was so brand new, man. And everybody would come up to you and they were just so friendly. They were always smiling. I'll be honest, I was a little bit thrown off because I was like, man, these folks are just a little bit too nice. They're a little bit too friendly. But anyway, I'm thinking it's probably church. This is probably what happens to people after they finally get saved and they realize that God can heal them and God can help them. Maybe this is how nice people get after the fact. So anyway, people would come up to me, invite me out to lunch. And at first I thought it was, like I said, I thought it was a little strange. I thought, you know, man, this is a little bit awkward of how nice they are. They don't really know me. They don't know who I am as an individual or as a person. And I thought it threw me off a little bit, but I put it to the side, because when you're there, all you're hearing is how much God wants to help you to fulfill your purpose, how much God wants you to help to fulfill your will that he has for your life. There were things that they were trying to get me to do that were small as far as in retrospect to where you look at what your Christianity is and what your relationship with God is. And so there were small things that they would, over that first year, try and get me to do. And I kind of was like, man, I don't know about feeling like this. I know the friend that had invited me out to church, he was big on me starting to wear like a tie to church. And it was all about, okay, yeah, making sure that you look good and making sure that you had a tie on. Everybody in there, for the most part, all the guys had ties on, suits on, clean shaved. And I just chalked it up to being like, all right, we're in a military town. Maybe this is just the protocol. But there were little things that began to start happening, even in the beginning, that I started questioning. I was wondering, is this supposed to be something that's really important, or is this just something that the organization is just bringing up because that's what they feel is important? But when you're in that spot and you're in the beginning, these red flags do come up. But because you're so desperate to be healed, you push a lot of those red flags to the side. We see this happen in abusive relationships a lot, where you see people would say after the fact, they would say, I saw all these red flags, but I just kept on going. And so for that first year, that's how I was. I saw these little red flags. I saw these little things that I didn't totally agree with, but I just pushed it to the side because I felt in my mind and in my heart at the time, the benefit that I was getting out of what I was learning and what I was experiencing in this organization really outweighed the little things that they were asking me to do. And so over that first year, I began to just really conform to what everyone else was doing and how everyone else was acting. I started going to a single man's Bible study. At the time I was single, and started going to a single men's Bible study and began to start building this camaraderie and begin to start building these friendships with folks that were in the church. But at the same time, what I didn't realize was that as I was building these relationships with folks in the church, I was slowly beginning to disconnect myself from relationships that I had outside of the church. And now looking back on it, one of the huge red flags that I've noticed coming out of this spiritually abusive situation is that a lot of times the organization or the church, they will cause you to be in a place where you disconnect from friendships and relationships outside of their organization, because they want you to be basically reliant on this hub of people and these relationships more than anything else. And so that's what I was doing in that first year. I was really disconnecting myself, getting, heavily involved. I loved the fact that we were witnessing. We used to go out on the streets every Saturday and witness, and it wasn't Jehovah Witnesses, but we were going into neighborhoods. We were on the street corners. We were the radical Christians that were really out there to really try and do something good for God and really try and do something that would make a really big impact in our community. And I bought into that. And that first year, that's really where I wrapped a lot of my mind and my heart around, was just really trying to make that impact. And so as time kind of moved on, I was involved in the church. And naturally, it's one of those kind of environments where if you're good at following the orders, or if you're good at following the pattern, or if you're good at following the guidelines that have been set in place, it's easy for you to move up in the ranks of leadership or influence in that type of church and organization. And so that's what started happening to me. I was good at following the rules. I was good at following the orders. And I began to do all those different things. And I began to move up in ranks, you would say. Began to help being a Bible study leader, help in different ministries in the church, started getting involved with a lot of different things in the church and involved in a lot of the ministries in the church. And before I knew it, after that first year, I went from maybe going to the church once a week to being there almost every single day, going for morning prayer before I would go to work, going after work for any kind of practices or ministry or midweek services or outreaches that were necessary. And so in that second year, my whole life and everything that I pretty much did for the most part outside of work revolved around the church. And it revolved around being involved with the church and being involved with what the church was really doing. And so it was just one of those things where, like I said, you don't really realize what is happening until you step away from it and walk from it. So about the second year, I was getting to the point, like I said, heavily involved in everything that the church was doing. I was involved in a lot of ministries. And I got to the point where I was realizing, like, hey, I need to get married. I need to begin to put myself in a position where I could do something for God, because in that environment, for the most part, they really tried to push the fact that for men, especially, being called to preach was a very high calling. Being a pastor was a very high calling and something to really strive for. I remember being in that atmosphere, and a lot of men they wrapped their minds around the fact that being called to preach and was the highest calling that God could really give you. But in order for you to do that, you had to be married. You had to be in a marriage for you to be sent out somewhere in order for you to pastor, in order for you to be effective in ministry. And so after about that second year, I was saying to myself, you know what, I need to get married. I began to pray about it. I began to ask God for him to show me and give me some direction on who my spouse needed to be, what I needed to be looking for in a wife. And he began to do that, and he did that. And one of the amazing things that came out of this experience and out of this circumstance was being able to meet my wife. I met my wife in the church. We courted, and we Christian dated, if you will, which was probably the best thing to happen to us, because we eliminated a lot of the physical distractions and everything like that. But this is really based on what the church's protocol was. And so me and my wife, we started Christian dating. We Christian dated for about 14 months, and then we ended up getting married in 2010, and life was just phenomenal. And then in that season of life of being newly married, my wife had been in that church since she was 16 years old. So she was just as fired up as like everyone else. She was just a brilliant woman, just a phenomenal woman to be around, and was just so on fire for God and fired up for God. And oh man, it was just contagious, and it made me want to just be so fired up to do something. And I remember going to the pastor at the time and saying, hey, look, I feel like I'm called to preach. God has been dealing with me on these different things. I want to go into the ministry one day. And so that's where I began to set my heart at. I began to set my heart and realize that I feel like God has given me these talents. He's given me these skills. He's given me a calling to help his kingdom and help build his church. And so we got married, and we began to really fashion and organize our life around that mission. Our first year of marriage, I got out of the military because I felt like I was going to go preach. I felt like I was going to go be a pastor. And so I knew that it was going to be challenging for me to do that in the military. So I got out of the military. My wife at the time, she was a high school teacher. We were working those things and working things through. And I remember about a year after, or that first year of our marriage, I got really heavily involved in leadership within the church and took a leadership position in the church that gave me a lot of access. It gave me a lot of ability to speak into people's lives and to be an impact and to carry some weight within that church and with that organization. And that year, man, we worked hard. We learned so much. We helped run a lot of different areas of the church, and we helped to build certain areas of the church and certain aspects of the church. Where I look at now, I look back on what were some of the red flags that I remember seeing and I remember experiencing that really kind of put me on edge. And so to even take a step back, I remember as me and my wife were getting married, and we're engaged, we're doing all these different things. We were working on planning for our wedding. And in the church that we were a part of, we did something called like a Jesus People wedding, where we got married on a Sunday and during a regular church service. And the whole point and the whole kind of thinking and thought process behind it was, if we did it on a church service and we did it on a Sunday, we would have family members there, we'd have friends there, and then we would have this opportunity to share the gospel with them. Hopefully they would get saved, they would give their life to Christ. But something in me didn't really completely, totally agree with doing our wedding on a Sunday, especially because I was thinking in my mind that this is our wedding, this is our day, this is my wife's day, this is something that is very important to her. She's been waiting her whole life to be able to have this moment. And I disagreed with it. And I said, you know what, I'd rather get married on a Saturday. And I didn't want to get married on a Sunday. And one of the interesting things that this did for me was, it was the first time in my experience in the church where I went head to head with the pastor and I disagreed with what he was saying. And I went to him and I said, hey, I don't really agree with this. I don't think that you should be able to tell us exactly when we should get married. I understand that this is something that's tradition, but we got family coming in from out of town. It just logically didn't make any sense. It just didn't make sense that you have a wedding on a Sunday and everybody's got to rush back on Monday. And so I stood up to it and I said, I don't know if I agree with really being able to, I don't feel like I agree with doing this right now. And we went to head on it, and it came down to the fact where I went to my wife, or my fiance at the time, and I told her, I said, hey, look, I don't like with the fact that he's got this much ability to dictate how we experience this moment in our lives. I didn't really agree with that at all. And I tried to get her to leave the church at that time. And I told her, I said, hey, look, I think I'm going to leave this church. Been here for a couple years, but I'm really not feeling that. I'm really not agreeing with it. And I was put in a position where it was, okay, she had been in the church for a long time. She had been in the church and knows the organization, but she agreed with, or just wanted to do this on a Sunday. And I said, man, wow, this is tough. Do I give up this woman that I love all over getting married on a Sunday? This is just so, it's a petty thing. But looking back on it, I realized that decision, and we ended up getting married on a Sunday, but that decision for me to bow down to that request and not really stand up for what I believed in or stand up in what I thought was right, I feel that was really the turning point within my own heart, where the ability for me to stand up to what this individual was asking, or what this leader was asking me, it was a turning point in my relationship with that church, where I recognized that this is a huge decision that they're asking me to change my view on or change my stance on. And being willing to succumb to what leadership was asking me was really a turning point, where I was really willing to succumb to all these other areas in my life. And that's how spiritual abuse kind of works. In the beginning, they don't ask you right up front to, hey, I want you to give up this thing in your life or change this because I said so. It's a very incremental, it's a very subtle, it's a very slow fade, if you will, of you giving up your rights to make a choice and make a decision that you know or that you feel is best for you. And so I did that. And everything began to start shifting. After that, we got married. Like I mentioned before, we got heavily involved in leadership. I felt like I'm called to preach. I want to get sent out. And within a year after our marriage, actually closer to 2 years after our marriage, we were sent out. Our pastor came to us and he said, hey, look, there's a church in North Carolina that needs a pastor. And we're thinking about moving some folks around, moving some individuals around. Would you be willing to go down there and pastor this church? And at that point, I was so deep into what the church was doing and believing what the church was doing that I said, absolutely. I didn't even think about it twice. I said, hey, we'll give up our job. We don't know what we're going to do. I didn't even know how it was going to work down there. I didn't know how we were going to figure things out. All I know is that we were going to a church that had probably about 10 people down there, a little handful of people in church. And this was an opportunity for us to do something good for God, because in our organization, this is what was really encouraged. This is what was really pushed, is us to be able to go out and do this for God and do something for God. And so we were on board, man. And so in 2012, we packed up, me and my wife, left our house, left our jobs, left everything, and said, we're going down to North Carolina and we are going to do something for God. And honestly, looking back on it, those years that we were down in North Carolina were probably some of the most eventful, the best memories that we had really doing that. Because we went down there, we weren't underneath anybody. I was a senior pastor there. In my mind, I'm like, man, let's just go out here. Let's just help folks. Let's just help people heal. I know we got this pattern that we got to follow, because that's what they expected of us when we did go to pastor a church, was keeping with those guidelines. And I understood that. And I did to try and keep those guidelines as close as possible. But at the end of the day, for me, I said, man, I'm going down here to really help people find Christ. I'm really going down here to help people heal and help people to hear the gospel. And for some years, that's what we went down there to do. We went down there. We were an island unto our own. We were out there and we began to grow this church. And the years that we were down there, we grew it to a good size for a smaller church. And we were able to support ourselves while we were down there for the most part. And it was just a great opportunity, man. And I loved it. I loved being a part of our church. I loved being a part of our organization. I just really just enjoyed that moment of life in ministry and being able to minister to people, really being able to help people. I was like, this is exactly what I was called to do. And so after being down there for a few years, Pastor approached me at a conference that we were at, and he said, hey, look, Nick, I'm at a point where I need an assistant to help me here at the church. We're growing, and I need somebody to be able to come. I need somebody to be able to help and come alongside of me and help continue to build this church for God's kingdom. And we prayed about it. We thought about it. It was a difficult decision because I didn't want to leave North Carolina. But looking at it, I thought to myself, wow, this would be a really good opportunity to understand the dynamics of ministry on a larger scale, a larger level. There's more people you're dealing with. There's more things you're juggling with. And I felt like it was a really good opportunity for me to learn and to grow. And so in 2015, we decided to come back to Virginia and be assistants here, helping the pastor of the church that we were sent out of. And we get back in 2015, I hit the ground running. I have some experience under my belt. I've been behind the pulpit, learning how to preach, learning how to minister, learning how to help, learning how to allow God to help me, help others. And then we get back in 2015 and I hit the ground running. I said, okay, man, hey, this is it. Let's get it. I got some experience. I'm here to help. I'm here to build this thing with my pastor. So we get down here and a couple things. First off, we were in an experience, or I was in a position where all my income relied really on the church. My only salary that I was getting was from the church, and my wife wasn't working at the time. We were in a church that believed that for the most part, if you were in ministry and you were pastoring, your wife should really stay home and really help build the home and really help be a homemaker. I mean, looking back on that, knowing my wife and her personality, she goes 100 miles an hour. She's got her master's degree. She's probably one of the most brilliant women that I've ever met. And to have her be in this position where she was forced to really stay home and not be able to be creative in a way that she needs. This is where we were at in 2015. And like I said, just began to hit the ground running. And as we got down here, and we got back to this church, I started to really just start really recognizing some of the dynamics that can happen behind closed doors in a church. And the reason I say that is because being back here and helping in this main church, I began to start seeing the dynamics of leadership and how leadership handles certain situations, how leadership dealt with certain individuals. A lot of some of those conversations were really beginning to start to open my eyes. And the first year that we were back in 2015, there was a lot happening. We had our second child. We're trying to help build this church, and we're involved in all these different things. I had so many things on my plate, man. I probably was close to burnout, if I'll be honest, after a little while there. After that first year, we began to settle in. And like I said, I began to start noticing these little red flags again in leadership and with our pastor, and especially because now I'm having the opportunity to work so close with him. I'm having these conversations that he probably wouldn't have with other people. He's sharing opinions. He's venting about certain things, and I'm beginning to learn his leadership style and how he leads and what he expects. And I'm beginning to learn all these different things behind closed doors that, quite honestly, the average member is probably not going to experience because they're not there on a close level with him and leadership on a daily basis. And some eye-opening things begin to start making themselves evident. After about that first year, I was doing a lot of things there in the church that kind of really didn't fall into my, I guess you could say, my job description, which, looking back on it, I don't really think I was just there to do and help with whatever the church needed. If you needed me to fill a role, hey, there I am. I'm gonna step up, do that, because number one, I felt this was my calling, and number two, this is where I'm getting my salary from. And so after that first year, I began to start recognizing little things and little red flags in control. I started recognizing that it first for me really started with, as an assistant, part of my requirement was to preach on a weekly basis and to be able to minister on a weekly basis and be able to fill roles and to be able to fill any kind of slots that needed to be able to be filled when it came to preaching. And in the beginning, I began to start observing that the senior pastor would begin to question my style of preaching and begin to start correcting it and saying, hey, I think you need to take it a different approach. And hey, and this was not, for me, it wasn't really the sign of trying to control the things that I was saying. But I think now, looking back on it, it was more about trying to control the type of message that I was portraying. Because as I look back on what we experienced, I start recognizing that in spiritually abusive systems, there's a need and a necessity to get people and the members and the individuals to really stay in a certain box, in a certain context, right? When people start doing what they want to do or start recognizing that God can speak to them and God can help them in certain areas, and when they start recognizing that they have this power and this ability within themselves to go directly to God, to go directly to Christ, that can be a dangerous thing because they start asking questions, especially in a spiritually abusive system. Those questions aren't really encouraged, right? We don't want all those questions. We want you to stick with the pattern. We want you to stick with the guidelines and the way that this senior pastor wants us to behave and wants us to act. And so this senior pastor began to start asking me about my messages and where I was getting this inspiration from and how I was structuring my messages and how I was preaching and all these different things. First, I thought it was constructive criticism, but to be honest, I was like, okay, you're giving me constructive feedback in order to make me a better minister. But then I started over time recognizing that it was more about, hey, I want you to minister a certain way so that we're able to keep the individuals here in line the way that he wants them to be in line. And so that really started bothering me because it started really putting a limit. It started putting a cap on what God may have wanted me to minister, or how God may have wanted me to minister. My style and the way that I deliver things is going to be completely the opposite and different, maybe, from the way that somebody else might minister. But being in that situation, I started recognizing that this pastor really wanted to control the message that was coming across the pulpit. So that was kind of the first sign within this second year of me now being an assistant and being back. What also started to happen in this situation was the senior pastor began to bring up and have a lot of issues with the way that my wife was behaving. The way that, and that's the way that he worded it, was how she was behaving. Maybe every week, every 2 weeks, maybe more frequent than that. It could have been less frequent like that. We would have these conversations where the senior pastor wanted me, or was requiring me, to go to my wife and to correct things that he didn't like on how she was behaving in the church. And it struck me as strange when these requests started coming and these issues started popping up. Because in my mind, I think to myself, I'm like, it's interesting because my wife has been here in this church since she's 16 years old. And now she's, 30 years old. And we're talking about almost more than half her life she's been here. And it was interesting how it felt like there was no real issues with her beforehand. But now, because we're in this position and he has the ability and he has the right to say what he wants to say, now these things are becoming an issue. And so I was put in a really awkward position, because you got to think, let's take a step back. This is my main income. This is how I'm taking care of my family. At this point, I have my wife, I have my 2 children, and I'm a pastor here in this church. And now I have a senior pastor who is essentially my boss coming to me and saying, hey, I have an issue with your spouse and how she's acting and how she's responding. I need you to fix these issues. Even though I may not be seeing eye to eye with him on what those issues were, I was in a position where I had to go and address these things with my spouse, because this is my income. Every week, I know that my paycheck and how I take care of my family and how I keep a roof over my head is coming from this individual. And what was interesting, even more interesting about it, is the way that situation was set up was, for me, it wasn't something where I was automatically getting a paycheck deposited. I would have to get a handwritten check from the senior pastor signed by him every week or every 2 weeks or whatever it was to get my pay. So it wasn't like I could hear this feedback on something like I needed to address with my wife or my spouse. It wasn't like I could get that feedback and then say, hey, I don't know if I totally agree with that, because I could say, hey, I don't totally agree with that, but now I'm waiting on this person to give me my paycheck to be able to take care of my family. And so I was in this very challenging season of life where, I know that I'm called to pastor. I know that I'm called to be here right now and help this church. But I have this dilemma where I'm asked to approach my wife about things that he didn't agree with, or how she was acting or responding. I'm forced to now address these things, but I'm in this challenge where if I disagree too harshly, then I'm really running the risk of losing my pay, losing how I provide for my family. And so I began to start praying and asking God. I said, God, I don't feel like this is the right way for this situation to really be unfolding. Why am I being put in this situation where I'm having to choose between my spouse? Or why can't it be something where if he has an issue with, my wife, that we all 3 of us sit down and we address it? And a lot of times it wasn't really like that. It was more a one-on-one thing. And then I would have to come back around and now try and address it and try and deal with whatever the situation is. And it began to start causing a lot of issues within my marriage. It began to start causing a lot of issues. At that time, my wife really started getting heavy into pursuing her music and pursuing a music career. And there was a lot of things that he didn't really agree with and really didn't like that maybe she was doing. And I'm stuck in this place where, do I support my spouse, or do I support this ministry, or do I support like what God has called me to? Or if I disagree with that, does that mean that I'm disagreeing with where God has me and in the position that God has me in? And I had to make a choice. I had to start thinking like, okay, God, like, I know you put me together with my wife, and my marriage is this is my most important relationship that I have on this earth, aside from my relationship with you. And I'm going to have to fight for this, and I'm going to have to protect this, because I can't allow my marriage to be destroyed because of what someone is saying that they don't agree with. And over time, I began to start noticing that it was becoming a common theme in the church that we were in. I remember it even getting to the point where we would do these New Year's Eve celebrations and stuff like that, and we would have these comedy, skits that they would put together. And I remember getting to the point where they were making skits and making videos that they were showing the whole church about making fun of my wife and the music career she was trying to pursue. And as an assistant pastor, I just had to stand there and chuckle at it like it was funny, but inside realizing like, wow, this is to the point where we're bullying people in the church. And I remember when that happened and seeing that video and watching that video, looking to the senior pastor and thinking, okay, maybe we probably need to address that, or maybe say something about that, because this is the assistant's wife that the church is making fun of, and it's okay. And nothing ever really came out of that. Nothing was ever said about it. And it's at those moments I started recognizing and realizing, okay, we're in this type of environment where this is really more about controlling. This is really more about the perception and how people are perceived and how people are really looked at, as far as rather than what's happening to them internally and the healing that they really need. And so for me, that moment and those moments, that season where I was required to approach my wife about a lot of different things, that to me was a moment where God began to start showing me really what was going on, what the character of my pastor, my senior pastor was, who he was as an individual. It began to start really opening my eyes to it. And fast forward after that moment happened, where this was the beginning of like my second year of being there, or actually going into my third year of being there. And when I started seeing those different things, I started, praying and asking God, okay, God, I need you to really show me what's going on here. What's going on here? And as the weeks and the months started going by, I'm praying. I'm still having this conflict with the senior pastor, still having this conflict with my wife, and trying to figure those different dynamics. There came a moment, and I believe that, anybody that's in an abusive situation, and I know we're talking about spiritual abuse, but I feel like for a lot of us that have been in an abusive situation, there's this aha moment, almost like where this light bulb goes off and you recognize, like, what in the world, what the heck am I doing here? This is hurting me more than it's really helping me. And as I began to start praying, God gave me that aha moment. And this is how it went down. If you've been in any kind of church, you've been in any kind of situation, that Easter service is probably one of the biggest services and the biggest moments of the church. That's when most people come out to church. Most people go to church on Easter. And so I remember us getting ready for the Easter service. This is going into my third year of being an assistant there. We're getting ready for our Easter service. We know it's one of the biggest services. And as the assistant, I'm trying to do everything that I can do to make sure that we're prepared, make sure that we take the best, or capture this opportunity and this moment to have new people come into the church and help them get saved and come to Christ. And I remember that Easter service that year, really just trying to do everything that I could. And we had the service. We're there. Easter service happens. We didn't have this huge, massive turnout that we were hoping for. I remember also that service, one of the bathrooms backing up, and I remember all this backup, man. And I remember there being like waste all over. I walk into this bathroom on Easter Sunday, and I'm in my dress clothes, I'm in my suit, my tie, And I remember walking into this bathroom, man, and seeing waste like all over the floor and thinking to myself, wow, what in the world is going on here? And so I remember running and grabbing a couple guys, asking them, hey, man, can you guys help me clean this up? We're in this bathroom. We're mopping up this waste, trying to get everything out, trying to get everything, cleaned up. And getting done, my family went home. We went home. Everything was done. It wasn't the greatest Easter service in the world, especially having the numbers that we had and dealing with this backup in the bathroom. And it's part of life. And I remember going to church the next day, being there at morning prayer, the senior pastor coming and meeting me there at morning prayer. And he asked me a question. He said, Nick, hey, what was our numbers like yesterday? And I told him, I could tell he was disappointed. He was hoping for a good turnout, and it's fair, but definitely fair. And then he asked me a question on whether or not I had emailed everybody in our email list that was archived in our email list. And I told him, I said, you know what, Pastor, hey, I apologize. I didn't do that. I forgot to do that. And it was like a switch kind of went on in him. And he said to me, man, I could tell he was disappointed in me because that was an opportunity we missed. I understand that. I get it. Especially as a leader, you want to grow this thing, and I get it. But he made this statement, and I'm quoting somewhere and quoting on some of it, but he made this statement. He said, Nick, I realize and I've recognized that every time I have an assistant come back and help to assist me, our numbers go down, the giving goes down, things take a downward trend. And he said, looking back on it, I've recognized that the times that I was on my own and didn't have an assistant, things were going better and moving along a lot better in the church. And look, I remember sitting there and thinking to myself, man, the day prior, I'm doing what I need to do, trying to help the way I need to help. I'm in your church bathroom, cleaning up waste instead of spending time with my family. And I come in the next day, and essentially you're telling me that what you've observed is that my position here, my help that I'm trying to, my services that I'm trying to give this church are doing more damage to the church and causing things to go down rather than causing things to go up. And it's really my fault that all these things are happening. And you want to talk about an aha moment. I remember sitting there in that prayer room and looking and thinking to myself, wow, I can't believe that you're really telling me that out of all the things that I've been trying to do and all the things that I've been trying to help as far as build this church, you're really sitting here telling me that my worth as your assistant is causing you more harm in this organization than it is good. And the light bulb went off. The light bulb went off. God showed me right then and there, like, you don't need to be in this place anymore. This is not the place for you. This is not, God showed me right then and there that what we have and what we're building here is not God's kingdom, but it's rather this individual and this pastor's kingdom. And those phrases and what he said to me on that day hurt so much. And I realized, okay, it's time for me to go. I can't be here anymore because if you don't see my worth and you don't see my value, then I don't do you any good here anymore. And that was back in April. So I began to start praying and I started saying, God, you know what? Okay, it's time for me to go. I'm starting to see it. And once I had that aha moment, the red flags began to start. I started seeing it everywhere. I started seeing this abuse everywhere. I started recognizing, wow, this is what we're doing to people. And this is where it hurt me so much because I recognized that as an assistant, as a minister in this church, I had begun to take the same patterns of treatment, begin to take the same patterns of abuse, and I began to start abusing others because I'm just following the protocol, I'm following the pattern, but I'm treating people the same way that I saw this pastor treating others, and I'm hurting people the same way that I saw this pastor hurting others. And I began to start praying and saying, God, this can't be, man. And what I started doing after that is I started logging everything. I started writing everything down. And I started saying, okay, I'm going to start keeping record of this, because this could be in my mind. I could be bitter. I could be mad. I could be upset at the fact that this pastor just told me that he really didn't need my services anymore. And I could be mad at that, and maybe that's probably what. I really thought about it. Could this be, and how I'm acting and how I'm responding? Could this be coming out of me being angry and me being bitter? So I'm gonna start recording and taking notes. And time after time, as the weeks begin to start going on, I begin to start seeing red flags. I remember being in a Sunday school, about 60, 70 adults. And the senior pastor was there. He was teaching about, I can't exactly remember what he was teaching about, but I remember him asking the adults that were in that Sunday school, he said this statement. He said, how many of you get afraid or you get scared when you see my number pop up on your cell phone as a call from me? And I remember thinking to myself, what a question to ask all these adults. And I remember looking around the room, and probably about 60 to 70% of the adults in that room raised their hands saying, yes, they were afraid to get a phone call from him. And when he saw that response, he laughed and chuckled about it. And I remember thinking to myself, should I be under a pastor, or should I be under a spiritual director that I'm afraid of when I see his name and number pop up on my phone? Should I be under someone like that? Should I be led by someone like that? And more importantly, the question is, if we're in church, should that be the protocol that we're operating on? And these little things really started to happen. I started to see them more often, and I started to see them happening. And I'm taking notes on this, and I'm beginning to understand, and God is beginning to show me, Nick, I'm behind closed doors, I'm having these conversations, I'm seeing how the character is, I'm recognizing that this is not really it's on the outside or on the surface. We're making it seem like we're about saving souls, we're about saving lives, we're about helping people restore and build. And I'm sure, guess what? You know what? I know that at some point in the heart of this church and in the heart of this leader, that is the case. I'm not saying that's not the case, but I'm saying that the way that we were going about doing it, the way that he was going about doing it, was more about control and about instilling fear in the members than it was really about allowing God's grace to transform and heal people's lives. And I began to take these notes. I began to start doing my own research. I began to start studying, what is spiritual abuse? What does this look like? What is church leadership supposed to look like? How is healthy church leadership supposed to be? And what I was seeing and what I was experiencing was not aligning with what healthy church leadership really was supposed to look like. And as the weeks went on and the months went on, I'm sure that my behavior and how I was acting and how I was responding towards my senior pastor was changing, because I was starting to see a lot of things within him and how he was leading this church that I didn't agree with, that I felt wasn't really the way that God intended. This is not the original purpose of what the church was supposed to be. And I started questioning these things. I didn't say anything to nobody. I didn't say anything to anybody. I kept pursuing what I was supposed to do. I kept preaching every Sunday like I was supposed to, or whenever I was supposed to. I kept my nose clean. I kept doing what I was everything that I was asked to do. I did it. And that was my motive. I said, you know what, God, I know that I'm supposed to leave this place. I know that I need to get out of this place because it's not healthy anymore. But I'm going to leave in a way that they're not going to be able to say, oh, Nick did this, or Nick was in this kind of sin, because that's the way that the church really operated. Anybody that left, anybody that didn't agree, oh, they were in sin or they were in rebellion, that was the motto that we lived by. So for weeks and months, I just kept going along with the program, kept doing what I was doing. But all this while, I'm taking these notes, observing, I'm listening, seeing how people are treated, seeing how things are getting responded to within the church. And there were many times that things would come up, situations that needed to be handled in a certain way that weren't being handled, that weren't being taken care of. And I just got to the point where I just couldn't, this wasn't it anymore. And so I remember one Sunday we were having a revival. We had a guest pastor come in, and it was typical for guest pastors that came in. The pastor would take them out to eat, take them out to dinner. I would go and be able to tag along. And this was the case on one Sunday evening. The senior pastor was taking this pastor out or taking him to eat. And he came up to me and he approached me, and I was in the back left-hand corner of a church. And I was shutting down the computer and shutting down some things that I was working on. And he pinned me in this, and this is what it felt like, but he pinned me and boxed me in this corner. And he started asking me these questions. He said, "Hey, Nick, is everything going all right with you? You're not behaving in a certain way, or you're not behaving the way you used to. Something is not right." And I felt so threatened. I remember that conversation and feeling almost kind of like when you cage in an animal. And I felt so threatened, and I felt, man, why are you approaching me and boxing me into this and hitting me with all these different questions? And he said to me, "You know what, after I take this pastor out, I want you to come over. We need to sit down and we need to have a talk." I said, "Okay, all right, sounds good." In that environment, you listen to authority. You listen to leadership. You do what you're told. I said, "Yes, sir. I'll be there. Just let me know." I went home. He called me maybe about 2 hours afterwards. It's probably 11:30, close to 12 o'clock at night on a Sunday night. He said, "Come on over to the house." I go over to the house. We sit down. He starts asking me all these questions about where I was at, how I was feeling, issues with my wife, issues that he had with my wife. He started asking me questions about my Christian dating. Did I sleep with my wife before I got married? All these different things. And I remember sitting there, and I remember thinking to myself, and I remember God speaking to me that none of these questions are coming out of the heart of God. They're all coming out of ego. And they're all coming out of the fact that I'm behaving in a way that he is not able to control anymore. And that he is not able to dictate anymore. Something in me was shifting, and I recognized that I needed to get out of this environment. And he recognized that there was something in me that shifted, that he no longer had control over anymore. And you can see this a lot of times usually when you look at an abuse victim and you look at that moment, like I said, that light bulb moment where they recognize that their abuser has been doing this to them for so long, and now they're ready to move. You can recognize that shift and that moment. And for him, this was the moment. That conversation was this moment where he recognized that he didn't no longer have any control over me. And it's right then and there that I made up in my mind in that conversation that it was time for me to leave. It was time for me to go. The dilemma that I had was I hadn't talked to anybody about it. I didn't even talk to my wife about it. And I was so scared that because she had been in the church for so long, that if I approached her and I said, "Look, I'm getting ready to leave. I'm getting ready to leave this church because the way that we're being treated and the way leadership is being handled is not healthy." And I was so afraid that if I were to say that to my wife, she would tell me, "I'm staying here at the church," because this happened a lot, where I'm staying here at the church, and if you want to leave, go ahead, but I'm not going with you. And this is the fear that I started to deal with and started to really wrestle with. Okay, God, I know you want me to leave, but is my wife going to be willing to walk away with me? Some weeks after that, it was our anniversary. Me and her took a trip. We went to Rhode Island. We were sitting there, and I told her, I said, "Look, babe, I'm getting ready to walk away and leave this church because I'm seeing a lot of things happening behind closed doors. I'm seeing how people are getting treated. I'm seeing how we're getting treated as the assistants, and it's not healthy, and it's hurting us more than it's helping us." And thank God, when I brought that up to my wife, she was like, "Man, I am so glad." He said, "For the last 2 years, I've been wanting to leave this place, but because I knew that this was your calling and that you were called to pastor, you were called to preach, I just stayed and I said, I'm going to stick with you and I'm going to stand beside you. And so in that moment on our anniversary, we decided, hey, it's time for us to go. And we get back from our anniversary trip. And I remember approaching the senior pastor, and I approached him and I said, listen, pastor, I wanted to sit down with you. I wanted to sit down with the council because I don't like how the issues with my wife are coming about. I don't like how we're getting treated. And I wanted to sit down and just hash all these things out. And his response to me was, Nick, it doesn't work that way. You know, me and you have to talk first. But I knew, based on what I was learning and experiencing, was that an abuser is not going to want to sit down with witnesses. He's going to want to develop their story first. And he said it doesn't work that way. And I said, well, okay, if it doesn't work that way, then my next step is to resign. And he said, is this what you want to do? Is this what you want? I said, yes. I said, there's no way that I'm going to stay here in this church any longer and remain healthy if I can't even sit down with you in the council and hash out some of the issues that I have in my heart and in my mind as somebody on the leadership board here at the church. When I said that, all of a sudden things changed. It was like, okay, we'll get with the council. We'll try and sit down and try and work these things out. And I told him, I said, well, no, it doesn't work that way. You just told me a few minutes ago that it doesn't work that way. It has to be me and you one-on-one. And now that I'm saying that I'm resigning, that I'm leaving, you're now backtracking to say, okay, yeah, let's sit down and let's try and work this out. And this is what abusers do. As soon as they recognize that you're about to walk away and you're about to leave, they want to try and backtrack to try and fix the issues that they have caused because of their behavior. And that's what he tried to do. He tried to get me back in there. But at that point, I had made up my mind. I had said, you know what? It's time for me to go. It's time for me to leave. I don't want to have anything to do with this anymore. I'm gone. I'm done. I gave him my keys. I gave him everything that I had that belonged to the church. And I walked out of that place and I left. And it was a Sunday afternoon after Sunday morning service. I got home and I cried probably harder than I've cried in a long time. I think looking back on it, that may have been really the first time my wife had ever seen me. And we had been up to that point married for almost 8-9 years. That had probably been the first time she's seen me cry like that before. I felt like somebody took a knife and stabbed me right in the gut with it and just wrenched it as I walked away from it. Because you got to understand, with spiritual abuse, and a lot of times in these type of organizations, that your whole life, everything that you know that is familiar and comfortable is wrapped around these organizations and this church and this leader. And so when you walk away from it, you feel like your whole entire life has been shattered and taken away from you. And that's exactly how it felt. And we walked away. We left out of a church of hundreds of people. Only 2 people that I can remember came to my house to see how we were doing, see how we were. And I recognized, okay, this is just how the system is built. This is how it's set up. This is how the organization, based on what this pastor has established, works and operates. And I can't fight that. Can't go against it. Upon leaving that church, I probably went through the toughest 4 years of my life. My faith was shattered. I tried to figure out, okay, God, is this what it is to serve you? Is my trust in God completely shattered? My trust in the church completely shattered? My trust in my calling, my purpose in God completely shattered. My whole world, it felt like I completely, just the whole bottom was ripped out. Because not only did I not have the support anymore, not only did I not have the church anymore, but now I didn't have any income. I didn't have anybody to lead on except for my parents, and my parents knew what was happening. They knew everything that was going on, and they were a tremendous support, and they helped so much in this process. But it was just me and my wife and my kids, and we had to figure it out. And to be honest with you, after that time, I went back and was probably worse than I was before I came into the church. I started drinking again. I started just having no concern about my soul, no concern about how I was affecting people and how I was treating people, because you were so damaged and you're so hurt by that situation that you have no idea what to do. And for 4 years, yeah, because this is our 5th year of us being out of that church when I'm recording this. For 4 years, I felt like I was in the darkest pit probably ever been through. Went through depression, suicidal thoughts, you name it. Went through a lot of different things, abusing things, just completely and utterly broken is how I felt internally. And it really hurt. But what it showed me, and what I'm so thankful of for as far as coming out of this journey now, and as far as just making it through this journey now, and like I mentioned in the beginning of this, it showed me that what I'm not supposed to do as far as being a spiritual director, as far as helping people, as far as ministering to people, it showed me what not to do as far as what being a pastor is. And what I recognize now is that it really showed me what the heart of God is supposed to look like and how it's supposed to look. And because of that, I am grateful for that experience. I'm grateful for this experience of spiritual abuse. It took me a long time to realize it and a long time to recognize it. But now I'm to a point where I'm beginning to understand that what God put us through and what God allowed us to experience was not in vain. It was for the benefit and the purpose to help others that may be coming out of a spiritually abusive system, church, organization. It was to benefit and to be a blessing to others. And so for that 4 years, man, I went through the trenches, man. I went through it, trying to figure it out, still going through it, still dealing with the remnants of it, still dealing with the trust issues, still learning how to trust God, still learning how to trust his word, still learning how to trust the church, all these different things, still going through, still dealing with. But my encouragement in even sharing this story with you is that if you're finding yourself maybe in a spiritually abusive church right now, or you just came out of it, I want to encourage you with the fact that there is and there was a purpose for you to experience what you experienced in that organization. We may not understand, and we may not know exactly what that purpose is until we're already ahead of the game and we can look back and connect a lot of those dots. But there is a purpose for it. And the other thing I want to encourage you with, if you're listening to this, is that purpose, and really just the fact that God wants to bring you that healing through this experience. And he will bring you that healing if you just trust him. It's hard to say that. I don't ever want to be coming out of it. I hated when everybody said to me, "Oh, just get back in the church. Just get back to reading the word. You just got to trust God." It's hard to tell somebody that when your whole belief system gets ripped from underneath you because of how you were treated in the church, the place that was supposed to be safe. And so that's my encouragement to you, is that, look, if you're coming out of this and you're experiencing this, God has a plan for you. He wants to heal you. He wants to make you whole. You experienced this and you went through this for a reason. We are never going to understand fully God's ways. We're never going to understand why God puts us through that. I was in that organization, in that church, for almost 12 years. And I gave a lot of money, gave a lot of time, gave a lot of my talents, gave a lot of everything that I had to that church, thinking that I was doing it to help build God's kingdom. And there were times when I was, but for the most part, I realized that it wasn't necessarily God's kingdom we were building, but sometimes it's man's kingdom we're building. And so I want to encourage you, listen, God can help you. He can find healing, and he wants you to find healing through this experience and through this journey. I'm also going to share with you, I'm going to put it up here, man. Check out this other video that I did on how to get back in the church when you've been hurt by the church. That was one of the biggest things, and I'm still working through that myself. But there's a couple things in there that can help you make those moves and those moments. It's going to take time, but they can help get you back in that relationship with God. But until then, this has been Nick. Recreators, you're out here. You've been listening to this story. I wanted you to keep learning, keep healing, and keep growing in the things of God. Until next time, peace.